Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I have a video for you that I have been promising you for almost 2 years now, and that is my Reading International Fantasy video that I had originally announced with a TBR. I didn't announce the TBR, I had the TBR set, but I had announced the video and my intentions to read international fantasy at the beginning of 2021. I had promised you a video by the end of 2021. I also had read most of the books on my TBR by the end of 2021. However, there was just one little very stubborn book that took me until like last week for me to finish this book. So now I can finally sit down and film this video. However, since it's been 2 years since I first started planning this video, my idea of what I want to talk about in this video has changed a little bit. I originally wanted to have just a little video where I talk about which books I read, what I thought about each book, and so on. But now I still want to do that a little bit, but I don't necessarily mostly want to talk about the books. I just generally want to talk about my experience finding these books, my experience reading these books, and also just share my thoughts on those experiences, and not just have a, I guess, recommendations video, but also have a little bit of a discussion video. And the reason for that kind of starts already with me trying to find the books for this TBR, which I have to be honest was not easy. So first of all, what were my criteria at the beginning for trying to find books for my TBR? I wanted the books to be mostly high fantasy, adult high fantasy. I didn't necessarily want to read YA books. I wanted to read mostly adult fantasy and fantasy that I would consider high fantasy. That didn't quite work out for reasons that I'll get into later on, maybe when I talk about some specific books. And then the second thing I wanted to do was I wanted to read books that were available in English. Not just so I could read them, because, you know, my main second language is English, so even if I hadn't decided to choose books that were available in English, the other books I could have chosen were German books, but I wanted to do my best and find books that would also be accessible, or as accessible as possible, to most of my viewers, to most of you, and I know most of you speak mostly English, so, you know, I wanted books that were available in English, either translated or originally written in English. And I wanted to find books, at the beginning I wanted to find books that were very specifically just from authors not living in the UK or in the US or even Australia. And I kind of changed that criteria a little bit, because I just noticed if I tried only reading books that weren't written by authors currently living in the UK, in the US, or in Australia, in Anglophone countries, then I would basically not have a TBR, because there are not a lot of fantasy books out there that are translated, that have been written outside of the American Anglophone publishing market. And so I just kind of realized for myself that there's kind of tiers of accessibility for authors, or, you know, between authors and readers, for readers to get the authors obviously, but also for authors to get their books out to readers, that kind of goes along the lines of, you know, the lowest accessibility is authors that write for their own publishing market, that aren't from Anglophone countries, that a lot of times aren't also from European countries, and that just write for their own publishing markets, which I'll get to that later on a little bit when I talk about some books, because obviously not all books are primarily intended even to be published in the American publishing market. But that's kind of, you know, the lowest tier of accessibility for fantasy books. That's, I think, the least amount of fantasy books I have on my list are books that weren't written by English-speaking authors and also weren't primarily intended for the American publishing market. And by the way, I kind of included self-publishing within the American publishing market as well, at least self-publishing for an English market or English speaking market. Then the second tier I had were books that were written outside of America, the UK, etc., but were written in English and were sometimes even written for the American publishing market. And lastly, I have also some books by authors that do currently reside mostly in the US. And then the last tier, I guess, of accessibility I have are books written by authors that were intended for the American publishing market, that were primarily also published within American publishers, American, UK, Anglophone publishers. However, that were written by authors that, while they do now live in the US, or mostly live in the US, they have grown up outside of the US and have grown up internationally. And for me, the reason why I just talked about these different tiers of accessibility, as I called them, is not necessarily to rank these authors or to say, you know, these authors have it so much better than those other authors, they have it so much easier or whatever. Because when I talk about those authors having it easier, that kind of also assumes that all of the authors I'm talking about right now even wanted to be published in English at some point or published in America at some point. I just wanted to talk about it because I think it's something that we need to think about consciously when we start choosing fantasy books. That a lot of the fantasy books, even by BIPOC authors that we come across in our day-to-day lives, will be pre-chosen by the American publishing market and thus being made palatable for the American publishing market. And I'm just saying American as a stand-in for, you know, Anglophone publishing market. And I think it does influence us, and I think it does influence how we look at books, how we look at stories, how we look at genres. And I think it's a shame, to be honest. I think internationally there's so much potential for a genre, for influences, for different influences, that it just, I don't know, I just think it's sad how hard it is a lot of times to find books that just have not been intended for primarily American consumption. And I say primarily American consumption because we know even the British publishing market is strongly influenced by the US market and so on. So yeah, those were just my 2 cents at the very beginning, and now let's get into some of the books that I read, and I'll just talk about the other thoughts that I had while talking about these books. And I will also mention into which, I guess, tier all of the authors that I'm gonna talk about belong to. So before I get started, I just want to quickly mention that there's a bunch of authors on this list from very different parts of the world with wildly different pronunciations of their names. I tried to look up some of their pronunciations, but I have to be honest, my brain just short circuits a lot of times when it comes to name pronunciations. I have to literally have someone repeat it back to me and tell me what I'm saying wrong and how I can say it correctly a lot of times. I tried to work with Google, but yeah, I just wanted to say I'm going to be doing my very best, but the pronunciations of the names are gonna be horrible. And so first I want to start with some authors whose names I'm probably gonna be mispronouncing the most. And these are some international authors who published their books not necessarily intended for the American publishing market and originally published the books in not English. So in any other language but English. And first I have Angelica Gorostiza with Culpa Imperial, the greatest empire that never was. This is an Argentinian author, so it was originally published in Spanish. It was translated, in fact, by Ursula K. Le Guin. And this is a short story collection about this empire and different eras within this empire. It's kind of hard to explain. And it kind of already brings me to my first kind of discussion point that I wanted to talk about. And that is that some of these books were never intended for the American publishing market, and that sometimes when we read books, we just have to be aware that we weren't the intended audience for this book. We can still love the book, we can still enjoy the book, but if we don't love it and we don't enjoy it, it does not necessarily have anything to do with the book, but just, you know, that we weren't the intended audience. And for me, that was very much the case, I feel, with this book, because while I could enjoy this book on a surface level, this was just one of those books where I just felt like there were so many levels underneath that I just didn't get. Because I'm not from Argentina or even South America. I'm from Austria. I have some knowledge, little knowledge, very little knowledge on South American history and some of the discussions going on in South America, but overall, like, by far not enough to be able to properly understand this book. However, I do still think that this is a very prettily written book. I think it's a good translation, and so I think you can still enjoy this book. I still enjoyed this book without knowing the full depth of the book, but you know, that's not always going to be the case, and I think that's just a risk we take when we read international fantasy, when we read international books generally, when we read books outside of our own experience. But I think that's also a reason to read those books. I think that's a reason why we should pick those books up, to expose ourselves to different modes of telling stories, to different, you know, just stories in general, and to different experiences. And so yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to discuss with this book, and I think generally speaking I can recommend it. With this next book, I actually already have my third discussion point that I wanted to talk about in this video covered, so after that I can just breeze through the other books I talked about, and that is Legends of the Condor Heroes, or the first book in the Legends of the Condor Heroes, A Hero Born by Jin Young. This is very often talked about as the Chinese Tolkien or the Chinese Lord of the Rings, because it is an epic story of heroes in a certain way. It has recently been retranslated. I think this is a retranslation from like 2018, I believe. This retranslation was, yeah, English translation copyright 2018 by Anna Holmwood. I would not necessarily describe this as the Chinese Lord of the Rings, because I think it just brings wrong expectations with it. And that is that Lord of the Rings is the epitome, is the kind of blueprint for epic high fantasy. I would describe this definitely as epic. I would not describe this as high fantasy. I'm not even necessarily sure if I would describe it as fantasy. This belongs into the Chinese genre of, I believe it's called wuxia. So it's kind of a martial arts story, and as such there are parts in here that we from a Western point of view would probably consider fantastical. However, I am not necessarily sure if that's the case, you know, within its own context, within the Chinese context. It just feels more like mythology, kind of, where you have a lot of spiritual parts to the story that aren't necessarily meant to be fantastical as it is. Like, for example, mythology. I would not necessarily count mythology as fantasy. I know a lot of people, for example, put retellings also in fantasy. However, I wouldn't necessarily always consider a retelling fantasy just because it has fantastical elements. And this one kind of falls into this category for me. And that is also why at the beginning I said I had kind of intended to, you know, choose high fantasy books for this video, international high fantasy books, but I distanced myself from this idea because if I had done that, I would have very much had to choose mostly books that are intended for a Western fantasy market, because you know, not every literary tradition works the way that Western literary tradition works, and so genres work different in different parts of the world. when I looked for South American authors, for example, a lot of the authors I came across were mostly magical realism authors. So authors very much writing literary fiction that just had some magical elements to talk about certain, often political or social topics. And so while I do think if we kind of translate this one into the Western literary market, I do think this works as epic fantasy. It's not high fantasy because there's no secondary world. I'm not necessarily sure if I would 100% call this fantasy. Still very much enjoyed it though. Although this one, once again, you have to be aware this was written within an entirely different context from the Western context. As such, the storytelling and the way story arcs are built is very different from what I would expect in a Western fantasy series. This book was written very episodically and there wasn't really that much of a climax at the end of the book. I actually think the way this book was split into parts just kind of feels a bit arbitrary and not very purposeful, and it's just like, the entirety is too big to translate as one, so let's just chop it up here, here, and here. It just kind of felt like it ended in the middle of an arc, to be honest. But I think that's due to the translation and not due to the way the story was built, because I believe in the original Chinese, the parts are very different from the translation. So yeah, that's the second book I wanted to talk about. Then I have two more books that were translated. The first one is Wizard of the Crow by Ngui wa Thiong'o. I'm pretty sure, not pretty sure, I'm 100% sure I butchered that name once again. This one is by a Kenyan author and it was originally written in a Kenyan language that I'm not gonna try to pronounce, to be honest. And it is translated, however, the translation was written by the author himself. The author, I am not 100% sure if he wrote the book while he still was in Kenya, because at some point in his life he was exiled. However, as I said, this was not originally written in English. This one follows the story of kind of thought up republic, the Republic of Abu-Ridia. And this republic is set on the African continent, but it's kind of, it's made up like Wakanda, except that it's not utopian like Wakanda, but it's kind of a stand-in of a lot of corruption that was going on in the course of decolonization. And within this republic, the ruler wants to build this tower that will reach the gates of heaven. And then caught up in this whole thing is a man who gets called the Wizard of Crow. It's kind of hard to explain what this book is about, to be honest. This is another book that I wouldn't necessarily call fantasy. It is definitely literary fiction. It's maybe even magical realism because, it's kind of set in our world. It's literary fiction set in our world, but there are some kind of magical elements that are introduced mostly to talk about colonialism, to talk about oppression, to talk about social and political issues, which, for me, that is magical realism more than it is standard fantasy. It's also considered a modern classic. And to be honest, personally, I quote-unquote didn't enjoy this too much. However, there was a very specific reason for that. If you followed me already at the beginning of the year, you will know that last year I read a lot of books. I read 200 books, which definitely was too much for me. It meant that a lot of the books I read, I couldn't properly kind of just, concentrate on them. I couldn't take them in the way I wanted to take them in. I couldn't properly engage with a lot of books that I read, and since this is a very thick and a very dense book, that definitely also was the case for this book. So I do want to reread it at some point in the future. However, 2021 just wasn't a good year for me to read this book. And then the last translated book was the book at fault that it took me 2 years to film this video. It's The Widow Queen by Elżbieta Czeresinska, who is a Polish author. This one is more historical fiction than it is fantasy, to be honest. I am very surprised. Maybe the second book will have more fantasy in it, but for his first book I am kind of surprised that it's even added as fantasy on Goodreads, because the most you get in terms of fantasy in this book is just some visions from gods. And in this one we follow a princess named Sviatoslava, who is the daughter of this very famous duke within Polish history, and she's apparently this woman who supposedly somewhat appears in a lot of the biographies of a lot of the men who were very powerful at that time, from Denmark, from Sweden, from England, from Poland, but who does not have her own biography. And so the author sat down, looked what she could find, where she could find the name pop up in the like 10th and 11th century. And the author then wrote this fictional story of this princess's and later queen's life. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm gonna have a full review up of this soon, so I won't talk too much more since this video is too long already as is. But I can very much recommend it, although I do think you will enjoy it more if you have at least some knowledge, not knowledge, but you know, if the names that appear in this story tell you at least something. So, you know, just read up a little bit on the history of Poland, of the Scandinavian countries, of England around like 1000. Next I have two authors who write for the American publishing market, who however do not live within America. The first of those is Ashok K. Banker with the Burnt Empire saga. I read the first two books, Upon a Burning Throne and A Dark Queen Rises, last year. I still have to read the third book, which came out sometime this year, but I haven't gotten around to buying or reading it yet. And this one is very interesting because Ashok K. Banker is an Indian author. He is one of the biggest names within Indian fantasy. He has written tons of books, and this was the first series he wrote that he specifically wrote not for an Indian publishing market, but for the American publishing market. I do not know if his first language is English though, because obviously India has tons of different languages, so I'm not sure about that. However, this series was originally written in English. I think some of his other books are translated though, if I remember correctly, but I forgot to look that up just before I started this video. Also, something interesting, the series kind of can show how hard it can be to enter into the American publishing market when you're not from America, because Ashok K. Banker, who, as I said, I think has sold millions of copies in India of his fantasy books, did not hear back from most publishers he sent this to. He is a household name, huge in India, and yet most American publishers still refuse to even send him an answer back. So yeah, that's just as an example for how hard it can be for an author to be published, even if they're already big. This story is a retelling of the... Right now I have only the Ramayana in my head because I'm gonna read Kaikeyi next, or next month. This is a retelling of the other Indian epic that I forgot the name of, although Ashok K. Banker has also written a series on the Ramayana. But in this one we follow this empire where it is decided if the oldest heir will be the next empire by being set on this throne that will then burn, and if it doesn't burn the child sitting on the throne, that means that this child will be the next heir. Now it just so happens that there is currently twins, and the parents decide they will sit both of them on the throne, and if neither of them burn, then both of them are gonna be heirs. It's easy as that. Neither of them burn. However, suddenly a lost heir appears who also ends up not burning, and yeah, shit happens from there on. I feel like I cannot summarize books right now. I mean, I'm pretty bad usually already at summarizing books, but I feel like I'm especially bad right now. I also won't talk too much about my thoughts on this one because once I read the third book, I do want to film a whole review on this. However, what I want to say now is that this is another one of those books that very much and very noticeably is written by someone who did not grow up within the Western literary tradition. And I really enjoyed it. I find that very interesting, even if it doesn't work for me personally 100% all the time. It did not 100% work for me here. Record List, I still find it interesting, and I just like to expose myself to these types of books, because a lot of times the reason why it doesn't work for me isn't necessarily because it won't work for me ever, but just because it's something that I'm not used to. And that doesn't mean that it's something bad. And so that's also the case with this one. I also sadly only after I already bought this first one realized that this series was originally intended for the American publishing market. Otherwise I would have chosen some of Esher K. Benker's other books, and I do still intend to read some of his other books as well. I just want to see what the difference is, whether it's intended for an Indian publishing market or an American one. So as you have noticed, this is gonna be a long video, but the next book I have by an author who does not live in America, who does however write for the American publishing market, and who is not first language English speaker, is Aliette de Bodard with Fireheart Tiger. Aliette de Bodard is French Vietnamese, so English, I believe, isn't even her second language, but her third language that she speaks, and yet she still writes in English. So this is not a translated work. I have so far only read Fireheart Tiger by her, although I definitely do want to read more by her as well. And this one is just a sapphic novella that is set in a kind of pre-colonial Vietnam inspired world, following a princess and her infatuation. I don't know how to put it, but I don't want to tell you too much anyway, because as I said, it's just a novella. And Aliette de Bodard also, she is one of the youngest women with the most nominations for the Hugo Award, I believe. And she is also very public and just, you know, she talks a lot on Twitter as well about what it means to not be a first language English speaker, but, you know, write for the American publishing market and write in English primarily, and how she gets ridiculed because of that a lot of times. But yeah, definitely can recommend Fireheart Tiger. So now there's 4 books left. This book I have is kind of by an author who grew up outside of the US, lived a part of her life in the US, she studied in the US, I believe, and now, according to her bio, lives outside the US once again. And I'm talking about Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord, who is a Caribbean author from Barbados. And this one is a very folklore-inspired book. In this one we follow Pama, who has this husband who is very much a glutton, and then one day she comes across this magical object, and because of that a trickster type being starts following her, and the two of them kind of, you know, travel. It's hard to explain what it is about without revealing too much, because once again this is a very short story, under 200 pages, but I very much enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed how steeped in folklore it was. I would say Caribbean folklore, although a lot of Caribbean folklore is of course kind of an amalgamation from folklore from Africa, as well as indigenous folklore, and just, you know, there's a lot of influences and you can very much tell that. But I still highly enjoyed this book, and yeah, can definitely recommend it. Another folklore heavy book by an author currently living in the US is The Four Profound Weaves by R.B. Lemberg. They are an author originally from the Ukraine who has since also lived in Russia, in Israel, and now lives in the US. So, you know, there's just a lot of history to this author. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, to be honest. And this also is, as I said, very much a book that is steeped in folklore, and we follow different characters on their journey as they find their identities. I'm sorry, like, my ability to talk today is close to zero. I mean, it currently just is close to zero generally because I have to talk a lot in my job that I have now because I'm a museum guide. But yeah, there's folklore and things being woven. And there's a lot about gender in this book. The author themselves is also genderqueer. So yeah, it's hard to say what this is about exactly, but I did highly enjoy it and I can recommend it. And then I have two last books by authors currently living in the US but who have grown up somewhere else. The first one I will just mention very quickly because I do have a full review of that, which I will leave linked below and up there, and that is The Chronicles of the Bitch Queen by K.S. Veloso, who is originally from the Philippines. And it starts with The Wolf of Oran-Yaro, which I don't have right here because I lent it out, but the second book is The Ikazar Falcon, and the last one is The Dragon of Jin Sayang. And this one is a very, very traditional adult high fantasy, however with a lot of generally Eastern Asian, Southeast Asian influences. And yeah, I will leave my thoughts and my review link down below. And so the last book I want to talk about is Son of the Storm by Sui Davis Okungboa, which is the first book in the Nameless Republic. This author is originally from Nigeria, and while he took influences from different cultures within Africa, he talks about how a lot of his main influences do come from Nigeria because that is what he knows. And also he talks a lot about, like, once again on Twitter he talked a lot about how just when you grow up somewhere else, when you don't grow up in the US, it's not just that you grow up within a different literary tradition, but that a lot of times just words are used differently, and that of course then also influences your writing. And I do think that is noticeable also in this book, and that's also one of the reasons why I do love reading books by authors who aren't from the US, who weren't born in the US or grew up in the US. Because obviously, as someone for whom English is a second language, I already have a different approach to the language as is. And so I just enjoy it, just discovering how different authors use the language and just, you know, seeing that a book wasn't necessarily written by someone who's from the US or whose first language is English or whatever. I just think it gives a book character, it gives a story character, and that's just what I enjoyed also just doing this, I guess, challenge. And I'm definitely not gonna stop reading internationally. I will probably in the future maybe do a part 2 to this series, so, you know, just read more internationally and then introduce you to those books once again. But I just thought that this is a good start, but this has been a very long video, so let me just not make the outro overly long. Tell me in the comments down below what are your thoughts on just the discussion points I brought up, but also your thoughts on the books that I mentioned if you have read them. If you haven't read them, are you interested in reading any of these books after this video? Are you interested in picking up international fantasy in general? If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month will be left linked down below, so go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you very soon. Bye!